At the custody trial, my jealous sister said, "I want to see the look on your face when we take away your daughter." My parents laughed smugly, then said, "Get ready to be publicly humiliated." I stayed silent until the judge asked one question that left my sister frozen, wiped the smile off my parents' faces, and made their lawyer tremble when a secret about me was revealed. The courthouse hallway smelled like floor polish. I sat on the wooden bench outside courtroom, 4B, with my hands in my lap, and watched my sister Gabrielle pace back and forth while our parents whispered with their attorney in the corner. Every few seconds, Gabrielle looked over at me and smiled. "I want to see the look on your face when we take away your daughter," she said, loud enough that the people on the next bench over went quiet. She wasn't embarrassed by it. That was the part that stayed with me. She said it in a courthouse hallway like it was a reasonable thing to say out loud. My mother laughed. Actually laughed, the way you laugh at something genuinely funny. My father straightened his tie and said, "Get ready to be publicly humiliated. Everyone's going to see what kind of person you really are. What kind of mother?" Their attorney, Patricia Thornton, said nothing, just stood there looking satisfied. She'd built a reputation on aggressive family law cases, and apparently she thought this one was already decided. I stayed quiet, sat there with my hands in my lap, and said nothing back. My name is Natalie Reeves. I'm 27 years old. I had my daughter Sophie at 19, alone, after my family spent my entire pregnancy suggesting I consider other options. I worked 2 jobs and went to school part-time and built a photography business from nothing over 8 years, and for most of that time it was just me and Sophie and whatever I could pull together. Then I met Ryan 3 years ago, and 6 months ago he asked me to marry him, and 2 months after the engagement my sister Gabrielle filed a petition to take Sophie away from me. Unstable lifestyle. Questionable judgment. Inability to provide appropriate structure. Those were the phrases in the filing. All of it sourced from affidavits Gabrielle and my parents had written about me like they were describing someone they'd been observing from a safe distance, rather than a daughter and sister they'd known for 27 years. I read those affidavits at my kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed. I read them twice. Then I called my attorney, James Whitmore. James worked out of a smaller office than Patricia, younger, less flashy. But James knew something going into that courtroom that Patricia didn't know. He'd known it for weeks. He'd been very careful not to mention it where anyone could hear. When Gabrielle stood in that hallway and told me she wanted to see the look on my face, she thought she was going into a room where everything had already been decided. She thought she'd built an airtight case. She thought the narrative she and my parents had constructed about who I was and what kind of mother I'd been was the only narrative in the room. It wasn't. My attorney James sat down beside me on that bench and looked at his notes and said, without glancing up, "Don't let them see you rattled. Everything's going to be fine." I nodded. The bailiff came out at 9:15 and called us in. The jealousy had started 2 years before the petition. I could trace it back to specific moments if I wanted to, and I had wanted to, lying awake at night trying to understand how a person decides to file legal paperwork against their own sister over a child she barely knew. It started as comments. My parenting was too permissive. I wasn't structured enough. Sophie watched shows that weren't age-appropriate. I fed her the wrong things. I let her stay up too late. Each comment on its own sounded like concern. Together they had a pattern, a direction. When Ryan and I got engaged, it stopped being comments and became something organized. Gabrielle had wanted Ryan first. She tried to pursue him when we all met at a mutual friend's party 3 years ago. He wasn't interested. He was interested in me. I don't say that to be cruel to her. It was just what happened, but she had never let go of it. Every time Ryan and I became more serious, she had something to say about his past, his previous marriage, his financial history, things she'd looked up and formed opinions about, and made sure our parents knew. When he proposed, she stopped saying things and started doing them instead. 2 months after the engagement, the petition landed. I sat at my kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed and read every word of it. The affidavits my sister and parents had written. The language they'd used. Unstable. Questionable. Unable to provide appropriate structure. They'd described me the way you describe someone you've been observing with concern from a careful distance. Not a daughter and sister they'd known for 27 years. Someone they'd assessed. I read it twice. Then I called James. Judge Margaret Holloway presided. Late 50s, steel gray hair, an expression that gave nothing away. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, wood-paneled, the judge's bench elevated above everything else. Sophie wasn't there. She was at Melissa's house. I'd decided weeks ago that she wasn't going to sit in a courtroom and watch her aunt and grandparents try to take her away from me. She'd had enough of the tension already without seeing it in a formal setting. Patricia's opening statement went on for several minutes. She told the court I'd had Sophie at 19, which was too young. That I'd raised her as a single parent for years, which was evidence of instability. That I worked irregular hours, which proved I couldn't prioritize my child. That I'd gotten engaged to someone I'd known for 3 years, which demonstrated reckless decision-making. Every choice I'd made was reframed as a character flaw. Every hard thing I'd survived was presented as proof I shouldn't be trusted. James stood for his opening and said 4 sentences. The petition isn't about Sophie's best interests. It's about Gabrielle's personal grievances against her sister. The evidence will speak for itself. He sat back down. Gabrielle took the stand first. Conservative dress, minimal makeup, practiced performance. She cried without producing any tears. Said she loved her niece, that this was so hard, that she couldn't stand by anymore watching Sophie suffer because of my poor choices. Patricia walked her through it methodically. Times I'd been late picking Sophie up from school. Instances Sophie had mentioned being hungry or tired. The apartment, 2 bedrooms, one barely bigger than a closet. A neighborhood where Gabrielle claimed to hear sirens at all hours. My income unpredictable, some months decent, other months barely anything. Ryan, previous marriage, some financial issues, not a stable influence. 40 minutes of it. I sat there and let it happen. Then James stood up for cross-examination, and the whole thing came apart in about 10 minutes. How many hours a week do you spend with Sophie on average? Gabrielle said several, probably less than 5. How many of Sophie's school events had she attended in the past year? 1. The winter concert. How many times had Sophie stayed overnight at her house in that same period? Twice, she thought. Twice in a year, James said, but you believe you're better positioned to raise her full-time than her mother, who has been her primary caregiver for 8 years. It's about Sophie's future, Gabrielle said. What she needs going forward. What does Sophie say she needs? James asked. She's 8. She doesn't know what's best for her. But you do. Gabrielle straightened in her seat. I know she needs stability, structure, better than what Natalie provides. James let that sit for a moment. Then he asked about the apartment. Had Gabrielle ever lived independently? Yes. For how long? About 8 months before she moved back home. How long had she been living with our parents now? For years. She worked full-time in marketing, making around $60,000 a year. Living with her parents. Saving money, she said. Understood, James said. One more question. Can you tell the court when Sophie's birthday is? The room went quiet. Not politely quiet. The specific quiet that happens when something uncomfortable is about to happen and everyone in the room knows it. Gabrielle's face flushed. It's in the summer, she said. July or August? You're not certain. August 14th. It's June 22nd, James said. But thank you for clarifying. Gabrielle looked like she wanted to step out of her own body. My parents testified after that, my mother explaining that I'd always been difficult, that getting pregnant young and refusing to consider adoption showed a stubborn refusal to accept wisdom, that I was still making the same mistakes all over again. James asked her whether she'd offered financial help when Sophie was born. She talked around it. He asked again directly, did you offer money, housing, or childcare support? She said they'd offered what they felt was appropriate, which was advice to give up the baby. My mother didn't answer. She glared at James with a specific kind of hostility that I recognized from childhood. The look she used when she'd been cornered and knew it, and wasn't going to concede it anyway. A few of Gabrielle's friends testified during the morning session as well. All of them said roughly the same thing. I'd seemed stressed and overwhelmed the few times they'd met me. Sophie might benefit from a more stable environment. Their testimony had the quality of something prepared, each person hitting the same notes in the same order, and I sat there listening to people who had met me twice describe my parenting to a judge. James declined to cross-examine most of them. He just let it finish and made a note. We broke for lunch after that. I couldn't eat. Sat in the courthouse cafeteria and moved food around a plate while James reviewed what was coming in the afternoon. They're building exactly what I expected, he said. Judgment about your choices. Not much actual evidence of harm to Sophie. It doesn't feel like that from where I'm sitting, I said. That's because they went first. This afternoon is our turn. We broke for lunch. I couldn't eat. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria pushing food around while James reviewed his notes and told me they were building exactly the case he'd expected. Lots of judgment about my choices, he said. Not much actual evidence of harm to Sophie. We're in good shape. It doesn't feel like good shape, I said. That's because they went first. This afternoon is our turn. James put me on the stand first. Walked me through everything. 19 years old, pregnant, family applying pressure to consider other options. Deciding to keep her anyway. Working 2 jobs while finishing my degree part-time. Building the photography business year by year until it actually held us up. Why did you choose to raise Sophie rather than accept your parents' suggestion? James asked. Because she was mine, I said. I made a choice that resulted in a pregnancy, and I wanted to take responsibility for that. Sophie wasn't a mistake to be managed. She was my daughter, and I loved her from the moment I knew she existed. Describe your relationship with Sophie. She's my best friend, I said. She's smart and funny and kind. We have movie nights on Fridays. We cook dinner together. She helps me with photography jobs sometimes, carrying equipment and picking locations. She tells me everything. We're a team. Do you believe you're a perfect mother? No. I'm late sometimes. I lose my temper occasionally. There are things I can't afford to give her that I wish I could. But I love her with everything I have, and I show up for her every single day. Patricia's cross-examination came at every angle she had. My age when Sophie was born. The income fluctuations. The apartment. Ryan. She asked who had watched Sophie while I was working multiple jobs in the early years. Caregivers, I said. Vetted, reliable, the same as any working parent uses. She said I'd been working more than most parents because I'd insisted on raising Sophie alone. I said I was working because her grandparents refused to help. Patricia asked if I was blaming my parents for my choices. I said I was stating facts. I asked for help. They said no. I figured it out anyway. James called Melissa first. She'd known me since high school, been there when Sophie was born, watched the whole thing from the beginning. She sat in the witness chair and said Natalie is the most devoted mother I've ever seen. Said I'd gone without things I needed so Sophie could have what she needed. Said there was nothing unstable about me and hadn't been for years. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Brennan, testified that Sophie was well-adjusted, academically strong, and showed no signs of neglect or instability at home. Sophie talks about her mother all the time, Mrs. Brennan said. Always positively. She's proud of her mom's photography work. She brings up things they've done together, activities they have, things her mom said. She seems secure and settled. She said Sophie was one of the most well-supported students she had in terms of how present and engaged her parent was. Patricia tried to shake both of them, Melissa and Mrs. Brennan. She couldn't get anywhere with either one. They knew what they'd seen and they said it plainly, and there was nothing in it to pull apart. Then James called Dr. Catherine Walsh. I watched Gabrielle's face when the name was read out. Confusion first because she didn't place it immediately. Then something shifted. Recognition landed. And then, for the first time in the whole day, something I hadn't seen from her at all. Panic. Dr. Walsh had been a clinical psychologist for 23 years, family dynamics and child welfare her specialty. James walked through her credentials and then asked whether she knew the parties in this case. She had conducted a court-ordered evaluation. All 3 of us, me, Gabrielle, and Sophie, at the request of the court. The report had been sealed until today. Gabrielle turned immediately to Patricia. I could see them whispering, heads together. Patricia had the expression of someone running a calculation she didn't like the answer to. James had submitted the request for the evaluation weeks before trial. The court had approved it. Dr. Walsh had conducted it and filed her report under seal. Nobody on Gabrielle's side had known it existed. They'd walked into this courtroom with no idea it was sitting there. Patricia objected. The evaluation was never disclosed during discovery, she said. Judge Holloway told her it had been ordered by the court and filed under seal 3 weeks ago, and that counsel should have been aware of its existence. Objection overruled. James asked Dr. Walsh about Sophie first. Secure, healthy attachment to her mother, Dr. Walsh said. The bond is strong and appropriate and shows no signs of dysfunction. Sophie feels safe with Ms. Natalie Reeves, trusts her completely, and views her as her primary source of support and care. And Ms. Gabrielle Reeves. Sophie has minimal attachment to her aunt. She described the relationship as distant and somewhat uncomfortable. When I asked Sophie directly whether she would want to live with Ms. Gabrielle Reeves, she became visibly distressed and stated clearly that she wants to stay with her mother. Gabrielle had gone completely white. My parents hadn't moved. Dr. Walsh described what the evaluation of Gabrielle had found. Significant jealousy toward her sister. A fixation on perceived injustices in the family going back years. What appeared to be a desire for control rather than genuine concern for Sophie's well-being. When asked specific questions about Sophie's daily routines, her interests, what she needed, Gabrielle had struggled to give accurate answers. In your professional opinion, James said, would placing Sophie in Ms. Gabrielle Reeves's custody serve the child's best interests? Absolutely not. Removing Sophie from her primary attachment figure would be traumatic. Placing her with someone she has minimal connection to, regardless of that person's intentions, would cause harm. Sophie is thriving where she is. There is no compelling reason to disrupt that. Patricia's cross was short and didn't land anywhere. The credentials were solid, the methodology was thorough, and the conclusions were documented specifically. There was nothing to go after. Attacking the findings would have meant arguing that Sophie wasn't thriving, which Mrs. Brennan had just testified against under oath, or that the attachment between me and Sophie wasn't real, which the evaluation had documented in detail. Patricia sat down. Ryan testified after Dr. Walsh. He talked about Sophie and about us and about the home we were building. He didn't perform anything. He just said what was true and said it steadily. Sophie is going to be my daughter, he said. Not biologically, but in every way that matters. I love her and I'm committed to helping Natalie raise her. We're building a family together, and I'm not going anywhere. Patricia brought up the previous marriage on cross. The bankruptcy 5 years back. Ryan answered both without flinching. Failed business, he said. Rebuilt since then. Stable employment now as a project manager, good credit, no outstanding debts. His attorney had told him to expect those questions and he had prepared for them, but he didn't sound prepared in the way that prepared people sometimes do. He sounded like someone telling the truth, which is a different quality entirely and harder to dismiss. My past doesn't define my present or my future with Natalie and Sophie, he said. Judge Holloway made a note. She called a 20-minute recess after that. I sat at the table and didn't say anything. James went through his notes. Across the room, Gabrielle and my parents were huddled with Patricia, and none of them looked the way they'd looked in that hallway at 9 a.m. when Gabrielle had promised me public humiliation. The judge came back. This petition, she said, appears to be motivated more by family conflict than by genuine concern for the child's welfare. Gabrielle's face went flat. The evidence shows Sophie is well cared for, emotionally secure, and thriving in her mother's custody. While Ms. Natalie Reeves's circumstances are not ideal, and whose circumstances ever are, she has consistently prioritized her daughter's needs and created a stable, loving home. The bond between mother and child is strong and healthy. She looked directly at Gabrielle. I have significant concerns about your motivations in filing this petition. The evidence suggests this is more about your relationship with your sister than about Sophie's best interests. Dr. Walsh's evaluation supports that conclusion. Then she turned to my parents. Your testimony today revealed a long-standing pattern of judgment toward your daughter Natalie without corresponding support. You criticized her choices while refusing to help her succeed. That does not reflect well on your claims to have Sophie's well-being at heart. Gavel. Petition denied. Custody of Sophie Reeves remains with her mother. All visitation between Sophie and the petitioner to be supervised until family therapy has been completed to address the dysfunction evident in this family system. Gabrielle stood up hard enough that her chair scraped back loud across the floor. This is ridiculous. You didn't even listen. You are dangerously close to contempt, Judge Holloway said. I suggest you sit down and consider very carefully whether challenging this ruling is worth the consequences." She sat. The smugness from the hallway that morning was completely gone. What was there instead was the specific expression of someone who had been absolutely certain they were right and had just found out in a room full of people that they weren't. The smugness from the hallway that morning was completely gone. In its place was something I recognized as the specific humiliation of a person who had been absolutely certain they were right and had just found out in public that they weren't. Patricia gathered her files and moved toward the door without making eye contact with anyone. My parents didn't look at me. James shook my hand. "Congratulations," he said. "You did great up there." I thanked him. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like sitting down somewhere quiet. I got to my car and called Melissa and told her the outcome, and then I just sat there for a while with the phone in my lap. The fear that had been sitting in my chest since Gabrielle filed that petition 2 months ago was still there, slow to understand it was over. That's how it works. You can't just turn it off. My phone buzzed. "My mother, this isn't over. You've turned our family against each other, and we won't forget it." I blocked the number. Gabrielle a few minutes later. "You think you won? You just made sure Sophie grows up knowing her family tried to save her from you. That's going to haunt her." I blocked that one too. The supervised visitation requirement meant Gabrielle would have almost no access to Sophie going forward, and none of it unsupervised. That was the outcome I needed more than any other part of the ruling. Then I drove to Melissa's to get my daughter. I thought about the hallway that morning on the drive to Melissa's. Gabrielle pacing back and forth. My father straightening his tie. The confidence they'd carried into that building. The absolute certainty that they had constructed something solid enough to take Sophie from me. Patricia Thornton had a reputation and a glass office tower and a long record of aggressive family law cases. She'd told them they had a strong case. Maybe she'd believed that when she said it. What she hadn't known, what none of them had known, was that 6 weeks before the trial James had submitted a request to the court for a full psychological evaluation of all parties, and the court had approved it, and Dr. Walsh had conducted it, and the report had been filed under seal and was sitting there waiting. When Dr. Walsh was sworn in, I watched Gabrielle's face go through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. Confusion because she didn't recognize the name. Recognition because she'd met Dr. Walsh during the evaluation process. Then panic because she understood what was about to happen. Everything they'd built their case on was about to be assessed by someone who had actually spent time with Sophie and asked her direct questions about her life, and come to professional conclusions. And Gabrielle knew in that moment what those conclusions were going to say. She had sat across from Dr. Walsh and not been able to accurately describe Sophie's daily routine. She had not known her birthday. She had, apparently, when asked what Sophie's favorite things were, described interests that Sophie had outgrown 2 years ago. Dr. Walsh had noted all of it. The smugness in that hallway had cost them something. They'd been so certain they were going to win that they hadn't prepared for the possibility that they wouldn't. Patricia hadn't followed up on the sealed evaluation because she hadn't imagined it would matter. That was the mistake. James had counted on exactly that. Sophie ran out the front door before I'd even parked properly. "Did the judge say I can stay with you?" she asked. "Yes. You're staying with me. Forever." "Good." She pressed her face into my jacket. "I told that doctor lady I wanted to stay with you. I was scared she wouldn't listen." "She listened," I said. "And she told the judge you were right where you belong." That night Ryan came over and we told Sophie together that it was done, that she was safe, that no one was taking her anywhere. She was quieter than usual, sitting cross-legged on the couch, working through something. Sophie processes things slowly, always has, turns them over until they make sense. "Why did Aunt Gabrielle want me to live with her?" she said. "Doesn't she know I love you?" "I think she got confused about some things," I said. "She made a choice that wasn't about what's best for you. Sometimes adults do that." "Are we still going to see her?" "Sometimes, with someone else there. Things are going to be different now." She thought about that. "Okay, then, can we have movie night anyway? Even though it's not Friday. Pick anything you want." She chose the one about the family that stays together despite everything trying to take them apart. She always chooses that one. We watched it on the couch, Ryan on one side and Sophie on the other, and she fell asleep before the ending the way she always does, and I sat there in the quiet with her head on my shoulder and felt the first real stillness I'd had in months. I'd had Sophie at 19 with no money, no support, and a family who had made their position on the situation very clear from the beginning. I'd worked 2 jobs and gone to school and figured out childcare and built a business year by year and shown up for her every single day for 8 years. Not perfectly. Late sometimes. Stretched thin sometimes. But there, always there, every day without exception. Gabrielle had filed a 50-page petition about my failures. She'd sat in a courtroom and cried without tears and described my apartment and my neighborhood and my income. She'd submitted affidavits and hired an attorney and stood in a hallway and told me she wanted to see the look on my face when they won. She'd seen the look on my face. It wasn't what she was expecting. Dr. Walsh's evaluation had been the thing they didn't know existed. James had requested it weeks before the trial. The court had approved it. It had been conducted and filed under seal, and Gabrielle and my parents had walked into that courtroom with no idea it was coming. 23 years of clinical psychology, a thorough evaluation of everyone involved, and a report that said in professional language what I already knew. Sophie was thriving. The bond was strong. There was no compelling reason to disrupt it. And Gabrielle couldn't name the birthday of the child she'd claimed to be fighting for. The secret revealed in that courtroom wasn't about me. It was about them. The jealousy Gabrielle had been carrying since Ryan chose me instead of her. The judgment my parents had deployed my entire life, without any of the support that might have made it easier to meet. The complete absence of actual knowledge about Sophie, who she was, what she needed, what she cared about, from the people who had stood up in court and claimed to love her. I'd stayed silent in that hallway when Gabrielle said her piece. I'd said nothing when my father straightened his tie and promised public humiliation. I'd sat there with my hands in my lap because there was nothing to say, and because James had told me everything was going to be fine, and because I believed him. Sophie is 8. She's funny and sharp, and she always picks the same movie and falls asleep before the end. She comes to school clean and fed and happy, and tells her teacher about her mom's photography work. She says everything to me, all of it, everything that matters to her. She's mine. She has been since the moment I knew she existed. That was always going to be the only thing that mattered in that courtroom. Gabrielle wanted to see a specific look on my face. What she saw instead was a mother who had never needed saving from. Ryan left around 10. I sat for a while after in the quiet apartment with Sophie's monitor on low, and the week's worth of tension finally starting to release. I thought about 19-year-old me, sitting across from my parents while they explained, reasonably carefully, in the same tone my mother had used her entire life, why giving Sophie up was the right thing to do. The responsible thing. The unselfish thing. I'd said no. They'd looked at each other the way they always looked at each other when I said no, the look that meant she'll come around. She always does. I didn't come around. I got 2 jobs and a babysitter I trusted, and I figured out how to do the thing they said I couldn't. And 8 years later they'd sat in a courtroom and testified about my failings to a judge who had then told them, on the record, that their pattern of judgment without support did not reflect well on their claims to have Sophie's well-being at heart. I don't know what happens with my family after this. My mother's number is blocked. Gabrielle's is blocked. My father hasn't contacted me, and I haven't contacted him. The supervised visitation requirement gives Gabrielle minimal access to Sophie going forward, and none of it without another adult present, which is the part of the ruling that matters most practically. There are things I want to say about what it feels like to sit in a courtroom and listen to your own family describe you as unfit, and I want to say them without dressing them up, because dressing them up would be the wrong register for what it actually was. It was humiliating. It was painful. It was 2 months of fear that some judge might look at the narrative they'd constructed and decide it was true. And then it was over. And Sophie ran out of Melissa's front door before I'd finished parking and asked if the judge said she could stay with me, and I said yes, and she pressed her face into my jacket, and that was the whole thing. That was all of it. She's 8. She picks the same movie every time. She falls asleep before the ending every single time, and every time she does I just sit there and let it finish because she's there and she's mine, and that's the thing that was always going to be true no matter what anyone filed or testified or promised in a courthouse hallway. Gabrielle wanted to see a specific look on my face. She saw it. It just wasn't the one she was expecting.